William, your videographer from Two Hats Publishing. Welcome to the College of Complexes, being held at Barbeck's Restaurant at 8949 Garland Road, Dallas, Texas. Gently embracing the east side of White Rock Lake. When I entered, I was greeted like coming home to Grandma's house, warm and friendly. When visiting the Barbeck's Restaurant, tell them you want your reservations for the next College of Complex class.
Evening with a lovely breeze blowing outside. I guess we could go out and sit at a picnic table, but somehow I don't think we'd get enough to sign up and do that tonight. But glad you could get out tonight. Welcome to the Saturday night College of Complexes. And you're missing Tom saying hello tonight because they're listening to somebody do that up in Chicago this evening, getting to attend their whole old hometown college this evening. And then either on Sunday or Monday they're headed off to Michigan on the train and house sit for someone's house while they go off to Iceland. Who knows, maybe they could get over there and trade on that. Ooh, something's echoing. Is it? Anyway, welcome to the gang tonight. I'm not gonna make any of the standard read off announcements this evening. I think everyone's been to a meeting before. They know what we are and what we're doing, and our general format of speaker and then questions and answers, and then an opportunity for all of us to get up and take several minutes, usually about 4 or 5 minutes, and make some comments about the presentation tonight, offer some of our views. We might alter them too, but you never know. And raise any issues that we might want to raise tonight. Did everyone get a meeting notice announcing the meeting tonight? Anybody not get a notice? Did not get a meeting notice? Something wrong with the mailing list. Should be on there. We'll have to talk with Tom when he gets back, try to get that all updated. But I'm not going to go through all the programs, but we do have the next 3 Saturdays after tonight are scheduled in. And then Tom has a person for the 2nd and 3rd Saturday in August who wants to speak, but he doesn't have their presentation materials yet, so they're not yet printed on the program. But, tonight, we have a good relevant subject addressing the wealth gap. That's been discussed a lot in the media here of late, and some of it is pretty informative, and some of it I read it and I sort of say, well, yeah, there's a gap, but I'd sure like to hear a little bit more of your viewpoint about what's good and what's bad about it. So Jim will be equipped to address that and give us some of the things that he's found in studying the issue and offer us some comments and viewpoints about it. Looking forward to that. Next week, Lloyd Chappelle speaks, and Lloyd has spoken to us 3 or 4 times now, and he always has something good he can get out and study. He's involved in investment analysis. He really understands economics and accounting and reporting and numbers quite well, but he gets off into things that are very political, and this is going to be lessons from the fall of the Roman Empire. We all can remember from back in school years hearing about how the Roman Empire came up and defeated the Greeks and became the power of the world and ran it for a long, long time, and we're all the way up in England and down in Africa and scattered all over everywhere, and then it started coming apart. So Lloyd is going to try to pick up on some of the things that we can see in looking back at what made Rome so successful and what some of the things that caused it to come apart at the seams, and hopefully watch and be sure we don't do some of the same things. So I'm not going to read off the rest of it to you, but this Saturday and next Saturday we have good programs as always and good speakers who we enjoy listening to, and so we'll get on with it here this evening. Now before I bring Jim up, who's all fed and fired up and ready to go. Does anyone have any meetings or things that they need to announce this evening before we start the speaking part of the program? I see Susie wiping her mouth, so perhaps. She's rising, so likely. Come on up, Susie.
Hi, thanks everybody for being here tonight. I just would like everyone to please honor our request that one person speak at a time so that we can all focus on what that person is saying. Unless he's inviting questions, wait and hold your questions until the question and answer part. And then know that you'll get an opportunity to comment on what he has said after the question and answer part has concluded. Also, remember, we're allowed to use this room for free, so please be generous with the server. And we're going to try to conclude and be physically out of this room by 8:45 so that they can wrap up and, because they like to close the restaurant on time at 9 o'clock. Thanks.
Home at 9, yeah. Well, thank you, Susie. I've been rattling that one off, so you've got that responsibility off of my shoulders tonight. Thank you very much. Okay, anybody else have anything they need to announce? Well, let's get it going. I told Ray I set my phone to go off, so I kind of have an idea when it's time to go on to the next stage. I won't let it run to infinity. Jim doesn't talk for an hour and 79 minutes, so I don't. We've never had to put a lasso around his left leg and tug on him and tell him it's time to quit, so that takes care of itself well. But we always enjoy Jim and the information he can find and present to us. So Jim, bring it on. We're ready to hear you. Welcome him.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. First things first, nobody's interesting after 20 minutes, so I try to limit it. That was a rule I developed when I taught. Yeah, and I got some opening remarks. You're supposed to have a point of view, and I do. The point of view is that there is a wealth gap and there's an income gap, and I use those interchangeably, and I got a little sloppy in that, but there's both. The second thing is the main point is that there is a gap, and I'm going to make the case for it being a bad thing. Okay, so, and as far as the evidence and the facts that I put together, I don't think there's not much that's really new. A lot of this stuff I think you've heard before. That being the case, if there is something new, it's probably the packaging and the point of view. Anyways, we'll get into it now. But it's simpler than you'd suppose. We can start with the undeniable fact that there is a wealth gap, and in 2007, the top 10% of the wealthiest possessed 80% of all assets, and not much has changed since then. Also, as far as income is concerned, that's the second part, the top 10% of earners commanded more than half of the country's income as measured in the 2012 survey. And if you're thinking to yourself, what's wrong with that? I'm going to get to it. This is the highest proportion in over a century. Investment and ownership is being disproportionately rewarded as compared to wage earners. And the reasons why are many, and I got this big long list here, and I'll try to wheel through it as quickly as possible. Number one thing, of course, jobs have been computerized out of existence. And you can argue whether that's good or bad, but it's a fact. Many jobs have been outsourced to cheaper labor markets. Tax loopholes have been created for corporations and the wealthy. There's excessive pay for CEOs, as evidenced by 65 pay ratios of CEO to line workers of 20 to 1. I'm talking about 65, and that ballooned to 270 to 1 by 2012. So you have to ask yourself, I mean, are these guys 10 times better than they were back in 1965? I don't think so. I'm sure there's been some improvement, just as there are improvements in productivity, but I don't think it's 10 to 1. Okay, also, 66% of all Americans think CEO pay is too high, and that includes 58% of all Republicans. There's about 4 more on the list. There's an increased and uncontrolled supply of labor due to unrestricted immigration, both at the low and high ends, until only recently. Now everybody's changing their mind and saying, oh, we hate this, but back in the days when it wasn't a problem, I mean, all sorts of contractors love having all this cheap labor coming in until they didn't. Big one is failure to reward gains in worker productivity, even though corporations are choked with cash and profits are at record levels. Further evidence is the fact that from 73 to 2011, productivity increased by 80%, while compensation rose only 10%, and since then, real pay has been flat. Okay, only 2 more. Lack of support for increasing the minimum wage, and we spend a whole hour on that, and I'm sure we'll get some questions on that. And there were systematic efforts to break or curtail the power of unions, and in that, and I'm talking about the long view, I think that corporate America and the moneyed investment interests have been very successful in doing just that. All right, so you endured sitting through this list, but I think that the mere listing of these factors, along with the recognition that policy has consistently supported or originated these measures, tells us 2 things. First, the fierce defense of the status quo by those who benefit from them is understandable because they like the money. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure that out. But the second thing is, even if there's been no war upon the middle class over the last generation or so, it sure looks like there has been and still is. All that's lacking is a formal declaration of hostilities. So this idea of role reversal, where when we complain because wages are flat, we're declaring class warfare, they got it backwards. If you look at that list of being, I know who's been making war on who. All right. Now, that's the picture as I see it. But I want to tell you now how the right is fighting back, so you can recognize some of their strategies, which you probably already have. They are resourceful. They've mounted a full-scale counterattack, and it's designed to discredit the claims I've just made. The first thing they argue is that there is no gap, but that has absolutely failed. Everybody knows that there is, okay? So you don't have to worry about that. But here's the second line. The second line is to acknowledge yeah, there's a gap, but claim that it reflects innovation, enterprise, and talent. It's all very meritocratic. The argument here is that producers and job creators should not be punished, and therefore there should be no limits on rewards, even though increasing wealth is increasingly abused by those who use it to buy and influence politicians. And you have heard the tired old argument that says, well, I mean, with all this wealth, surely they're going to invest it, and surely this will create a rising tide that floats all the boats, and surely it will trickle down, and surely we will all benefit, right? Well, that's what we heard prior to the time that we dismantled our entire industrial base and rebuilt it in China. They did invest the money, that's for sure, but not here, and it didn't result in jobs. So that dog won't hunt anymore either. And I'm not going to get into what they do with the money as far as speculation is concerned, because John Beasley covered that quite well here just last week, I believe, or a few weeks ago. And then I'm not going to get into the fact that money is now speech, because that's another thing that's done, okay, with this money, is it enables them to buy any politician and any law they want. All right, but we won't go there, because there's too many other things to talk about. But here's the third line of defense, and that's to argue against any and all government-imposed measures to shrink the wealth gap. Any redistribution or cap on earnings is always condemned as socialistic or Marxist, and proposed solutions are always to be market-based. In other words, keep your hands off and leave us alone. Let us do what we want to do. All right? This is even though there's plenty of evidence that shows that free markets are a myth, trickle-down never delivered on its promises. But unlike the Who, you fooled us once, but you're not going to do it again. So, I got counter-arguments to what they've just said. And here's my counter-arguments. And they're simple. Number one, a growing wealth gap is always a political problem, and making an issue doesn't automatically make me or any other critic a Marxist. Right? The fact that I criticize this system and I call for governmental reforms doesn't mean that I'm a communist. It simply means that the system ain't working and we need to fix it. Okay? For the record, I am a true believer in capitalism as it works when it comes to creating wealth. I want to repeat that. I am a believer in capitalism. It does create wealth. The problem is this: it has no formula whatsoever for how you cut the pie up and distribute the profits. And that is what the political system is charged with by default. You know, and and class struggle, I would say, is always perpetual, because in modern societies where wealth is no longer land-based, it's now capital-based, there's always going to be ferocious struggle between those who invest and those who work. And each side is always going to want more. So do not talk to me about this is class warfare. And the reason I say I don't want to hear about it is because there's always going to be class warfare in a capitalist system where some people work for a living and some people invest for a living. You're stuck with it. And the role of government, by the way, is to more or less referee that dispute. And if you want a definition of a good deal, I'll tell you what a good deal is both sides, after it's been refereed and heads have been knocked together, both sides walk away and they both feel like they got screwed. That's a good deal. That's a good deal. Because there's never going to be any agreement, okay, on what's fair. Because you always are going to think, I am, as a wage earner, I want more. And so are the investors. So we're stuck with it. Anyways, back to the gap. A growing wealth or income gap will always inflame class antagonisms, which are always latent for the reasons that I just laid out. Contrary to what some say, the United States is not a classless society. It isn't. I mean, and if you think it is, I mean, I can tell you right now, I'm not being paid $250,000 to give you this speech. All right? So, I'm getting a dinner, and I'm glad to get it. Yeah. Now, as far as not punishing the producers is concerned, let us note that CEO pay is way out of line compared to their counterparts 30 years ago, and I already mentioned that. But it's also compared to their foreign counterparts today. And why? It's not because of any fantastic talent, but more likely because there's a good old boy composition to the compensation committees that takes good care of their friends. And if you're saying, oh, well, they get people, okay, who are unbiased, who are not in the company, and they don't know them, and it's a blind type thing, I mean, I have an answer to that too. Here's the way it works. These CEOs who think they're very valuable say, well, I'm better than average, therefore I want an above average pay rate. So what do? They go out and they survey, what are CEOs in this industry making on average, right? So in order to get this guy who they think is very talented, they pay him slightly above the average. What do you suppose the math tells you? I taught math. The average goes up. That's what happens. And if you want to know about further abuses, I mean, it didn't used to be 30 years ago that CEOs were paid with huge stock options. But they put that in because Japan became a threat. And because Japan became a threat and they wanted more results, they figure, well, let's provide some real incentive. Well, the problem with that is that when you've got CEO salaries tied, not salaries, but bonuses tied to stock options, they have a very large vested interest in making sure the stock prices go up and up and up and up. And for that reason, they don't address themselves to any stakeholders other than the people who own stock, and of course they're very large holders of that stock, which is another reason, for why the stock market has gone up, and it's another reason for why their compensation has gone up, unjustifiably in my view. Okay, now here's what they'll tell you in defense. They say, well, if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. But that's cover for business as usual, and these folks have, and this is what I hit upon, they have the nerve to complain about collectivism amongst unions that does exactly the same thing for their friends. They fight to get as much money as they can. So, maybe we should go union bust as far as these compensation committees are concerned and start demanding that they stop acting in a collective communistic manner. Now, as far as the tax code is concerned, everyone knows it needs to be reformed to prevent legalized tax evasion. And there is legalized tax evasion. Now, you hear this crap that, we have the highest corporate tax rate in the world, and that is true. It's absolutely true on paper. But that ain't what they pay. And if they got the right lobbyists and if they've bought the right politicians, they got a loophole that they could escape through and they pay nothing. Enron, 3 of the last 5 years they're in business, paid no taxes whatsoever. 0. And we know who they made their political contributions to, and I'm not going to exempt Democrats when I say that because, they're in politics and they need money too. All right. Bottom line, it's not just the 49% that's freeloading. So now you're saying, okay, this is a pretty dismal picture, so now what's the answer? Well, if you're looking at me to provide all the answers, you're not going to hear them. It's a very difficult situation. But I would say to begin with, obviously some redistribution is required. I do not apologize in the word for redistribution. If the system enables outright cheating, and people not to pay their fair share of the tax burden, then you need to redistribute. But, if you use that word, automatically, somehow or other, you're painted as some sort of a socialist. Now, at the very least, the accelerating growth in the gap needs to be halted. Ideally, the gap itself narrowed a lot. So how are you going to do this? Well, that's where it gets tough. It's not easy. The tax code needs to be reformed. Good luck with that. Everyone for the last 30 years, Republicans and Democrats, saying, oh yeah, we need to fix it, but they don't do it. What are the Republicans doing these days? They want to portray themselves as being enemies of crony capitalism, right? So they go after the import-export bank, right? But completely have left alone and will leave alone, this tax code, which is entirely unfair because that would really hurt the people, that are sending money their way. But this, I'm getting off track here. I don't want to talk about that. All right. Now, you can list all sorts of things. Minimum wage has got to be increased. Money needs to be excluded. None of these are imminent, and some will never happen. I know that. And they're not brand new thoughts either. Everybody in the room, I'm sure, has had these thoughts, at least in partial form, and then saying, well, yeah, you know what to do, but can you make it happen? No, I can't. But here's the deal. Fighting for fairness and insisting that pay scales are fair and that everyone pays their fair share of taxes is something that has to happen, or else. And the or else simply means that, if we manage to preserve it, then we'll have a democracy, but we'll also have a society that's worth living in, one that we can be proud of. But if we don't, the American dream has failed, and we will be yet another sad chapter in the histories of nations that have failed to promote the general welfare, which is what the Constitution says we're supposed to do. And I say, if redistribution is required, let's do it. There's no clause in the Constitution that says redistribution is not allowed. But I want to close with some thoughts from Pikety's book, Capital, which has stirred things up a lot on this side of the Atlantic. It's made the New York Times bestseller list, and that's saying something because it's formidably weighty and it's published through Harvard's academic press. I'm wading through it right now, but it's like a page and a half a day, and I have to look stuff up, and it's not easy reading, I can tell you that right now. He points out many things, among them the fact that in both Europe and the United States, we have not seen such maldistributions of wealth since prior to World War I, and he backs it up with data. This is his major contribution. It's not that, he's making any new claims, it's just that he's got a lot of data to support the claim. And it's for not just the United States, it's for France, it's for Britain, and it goes back over centuries. Naturally, the Wall Street Journal and a number of critics on the right have been quick to fiercely denounce the conclusions, which include that wealth disparities always occur when return on investment exceeds GDP growth, and there should be a wealth tax to reduce the inequality. So let's take those one by one. First thing is, the fact that the criticism of the book have been so numerous and fierce suggests that the truth hurts. Now, other people might argue, well, it suggests that he's dead wrong, but I don't think so. As far as the tax increase is concerned, well, maybe. But the devil is always in the details. And here's the point I would really like to bring home. It's what you do with the revenue to reduce the gap that matters. So you got to think of two things. You got to think of bringing governmental force to bear to quite literally force a fair share payment of taxes. That's at the high end, right? Now, we can argue up and down as to how much that should be, but I think it should be more than it is now. But the other thing is what about the bottom end? What about the middle class? So your focus must be not only at the top end, and people who run around yelling, oh, we got to soak the rich, I mean, they've only got it half right. In fact, I would say that maybe only a quarter right. I mean, you're going to have to pry loose their fair share of the taxes that they're not paying. That is for sure. But at the same time, you got to do something with those revenues, and here's what I'm arguing. I have no problem with redistribution that finances an improved infrastructure and better education across the board. The latter an absolute prerequisite for better jobs and better wages. So, my view, that's the way to close the gap. Not so much by soaking the rich and corporations as punishment. I'm not into punishment. But forcing abusers, whoever they may be, to pay their fair share and then invest that revenue in infrastructure and education. Long overdue on infrastructure. And, we're falling behind as far as education is concerned. Thereby, we can close the gap and make the USA more globally competitive, and that's the name of the game these days, right? Got to be globally competitive. Finally, in view of how well they've done, the well-off should be happy to make an investment in the country's future economic security in maintaining the American dream. But I'm not holding my breath. So, last suggestion. Why not a cooperative effort that begins with an industrial policy and tax code reforms, rebuilds the infrastructure and establishes a first-rate educational base that trains up world-class workers, all culminating with preserving the middle class. No middle class, no America. So take your pick. We can have more confrontation or we can have cooperation. We can build more schools or we can build more prisons. Or we can have higher or lower approval ratings for Washington. And they can't get much lower. They really can't get much lower. Well, anyways, that's my view of what the problem is, and just summing it all up, there is a wealth gap, there is an income gap. And because class war is always latent and built in, it's a problem. It's a problem that government has to mitigate. The problem is that the government has been taken over by special interests that don't want it mitigated. That's the problem. And if we can, we need to take it back. But if you're like me, there are days that I have my doubts. And days I have serious doubts. Anyways, that's all I got.
Well, thank you, Jim, so much. You covered a lot of ground in a short time period. And now, as we've done in the past, this is time for question and answer. And that's right, I see a hand coming up already.
What are your thoughts on fixing our trade policies, the imbalanced trade? Anything and how that affects the wealth gap?
Well, the main thing is to make us competitive. You know, and to me, you start with industrial policy, which is you have a plan, okay? I mean, there was an industrial plan back 30 years ago. The industrial plan was to leave the private sector alone. We'll dismantle the manufacturing base, we'll rebuild it in China, and then we will sell back, you know, these cheap products, but we'll make a lot more money. Well, that's a bad industrial plan because it's hollowed out the middle class and destroyed it in large part. So my idea is that private sector, public sector get together, they put together an industrial policy with a view towards becoming globally competitive, okay? And there's going to be representation and room, okay, and consideration, okay, of quality of life, standard of living, maintenance of the middle class, as well as profitability for corporations. But it's got to be cooperative, and it cannot be left entirely to the private sector, because we've done that and it's been a huge mistake. Yes, ma'am. Over there, behind you.
Hold it up to your mouth.
Do you think this, you mentioned Europe, and I know this is a problem in Europe as well, but in the northern European countries, the Scandinavian countries are known, I think, more for their investment in the general welfare of the population than, I know there are enough problems in Europe, but do you think this is worse in the U.S.? And how about Asia? This kind of consolidation at the top, not only in ownership and wealth ownership, but in earning potential as well.
Well, the answer to your question is it varies. Now, at one point, the Scandinavian countries were very socialistic, okay, and they probably went too far in that direction. And they've come back towards the right, okay, and they've become more capitalistic in outlook. Now, my argument is this, is that all successful advanced nations have a mixed system. There's no such thing as a purely capitalistic system. There's no such thing as a purely socialistic system that works. Key phrase, that works. And people tell me, well, that's socialistic. I say, so what? I mean, all systems are mixed, so we got this hybrid, okay? And as I mentioned earlier, the problem that you've got, at least we have here in the United States, is government is supposed to be, in my view, a referee. The government is supposed to knock heads together and to force deals to occur that neither side particularly likes but can live with. That's fairness. Okay, and if you can manage to do that, okay, then you're probably on the right track. And you can tell that you're on the right track because then the majority of people in your country will be saying, yeah, we think the country's on the right track, we like the system, right? That's definitely not the case now. I mean, everybody thinks we're on the wrong track. But I also mentioned that government's function is to referee these disputes as an impartial institution. The problem that we have, and lots of other countries have, is that the government is bought and paid for. And so what you've got is a crooked referee, you know, who, and this includes, by the way, the Supreme Court, which I'm sure a lot of people will dispute with me. But I say that purely on the basis that the Supreme Court does violence to language and logic when they say that money is speech. It's not. But they've twisted it and reinterpreted the Constitution in accordance with the money interests, okay? And so now we have this, well, we don't have paralysis, but we've got this 5-4 split. Does that answer it for you? Okay. Yes, sir.
Given the fact that our founding, is this on?
Was.
Is it?
Twist ahead.
It's red. Okay.
Very good.
Given the fact that our founding fathers established a nation based on the idea of free enterprise, when did this term capitalism take over and become so predominant? Because I'm very opposed to that idea, as I'm opposed to the idea of democracy, because that leads to emotional lynch mobs. The idea of a democratic republic governed with reason and free enterprise is what this nation was founded on. When did all of this change so badly?
Well, again, you know, this is my opinion. The Constitution was written when the population, the United States had a population of 10 million people. The only people who could vote were property owners and male, right? And that was just fine because everybody was economically self-sufficient, and everybody that mattered, that is, who could vote, okay, because they had land. Land was abundant, right? But I mean, now capitalism came in about the time of the Industrial Revolution. It changed everything. I mean, Jefferson's idea, we would have yeoman farmers voting, right? Who had a base of economic security provided by the land that they lived on. Well, who has enough wealth in land here to be economically secure sitting in this room? I mean, that's the difference. The difference is that we've transformed. The Constitution was written for an agrarian society, which we aren't anymore. We're a capitalist society where concentrations of wealth have a lot more to do with the means of production than they do with land. Okay, and while we're at it, who is it? The ultra-right Supreme Court Justice, whose name I'm blanking on right now. Scalia, yeah. He's the originalist. You know, and then people are yelling and screaming about, let's get back to what the Constitution intended. Well, as far as human rights are concerned, yeah, I can go along with that. But it was written at a time when you got 10 million people and only men can vote, and there is no internet, and there's no such thing as fighter planes with napalm and tanks with rockets. And you're telling me that the Second Amendment guarantees that you have the right to raise a militia? That was what that Second Amendment was intended for, by the way, was to repel you could put together a militia that would be effective against British troops. Well, yeah. Any corrupt, undeserving government, But the answer to your question, I suppose, is capitalism. Completely transform the way we live.
Next question.
Next. Yes, sir.
Yes, the mic is working.
Jim, do you have the statistics on the disparity between what top management makes and then the lowest worker? Seems like I saw it 700 times. Does that sound plausible?
The ratio that I quoted from was CEO to workers was 20 to 1 in 65. It's 271 by 2012. So it's about 10 times, more than 10
I
times.
was thinking it was higher than that.
It could be since then. This is 2012. It could be higher since then. And I don't deny that people who are productive, should be rewarded. But when you look at the discrepancy between what line workers get or don't get, more likely, and what CEOs are getting, and of course what the CEOs are getting paid for is keeping the stock price high. Because as John was explaining, the lifetime of ownership in stock typically is seconds, right? So people who are not so much investing but speculating, not in growth, but gambling. I mean, you speculate, you want the stock to go up, it goes up within days, X amount, then that's just fine. That does nothing for jobs. Does nothing for growth, does nothing for a future, does nothing for the next generation.
Well, as Tom would say, come on, guys, there has to be more curiosity on the subject.
Curtis? All right.
When is the stock market going to crash?
Well, if I knew that, I would. You and I could get together and pool our money and go short, and we could really clean up. All I can say is, as an investor, I am a capitalist and I am an investor. This bull market is pretty old, and it's getting long in the tooth. And what was I reading today? If you want an indicator, I guess the big indicator is one of the indexes for the lower price stocks. I mean, when that starts going in the tank, you start looking at that. But I don't know. Answer your question, I don't know.
So you made a comment about, first, what is the name of the book and the author that you were talking about earlier?
Pekkety, Pikkety. He's French. And it's called Capital. That's the name of the book. And he probably named it after, he was tweaking people. He probably named it after Karl Marx's Das Kapital, is what he probably did. And his two main conclusions are you really need to start taxing the wealthy more heavily because they abuse it. And you need to prevent the abuse by taking the money away from them. By means of taxation. Of course, that created it didn't create a very big stir in France, because in France, that's kind of the gospel. I mean, they have a socialist president. But over here, it's heresy. So big wiggle, huge wiggle.
So do you think that there's any hope for restoring a bit of pay equity across the system to the hardworking and I don't want to say middle class because there are a lot of hardworking people. Take the service industry here, where the people who are serving you are probably making $2.15 an hour. Good luck. I hope they have lots of customers giving them tips.
Well, the answer to your question is there's hope and there's probability, right? Okay, there's always hope. You know, and I hope for the same thing that you hope for. But as far as the probabilities are concerned, I mean, I have my bad days, quite frankly. I mean, and the questions I ask myself, and I've not yet answered it, and you probably ask yourself the same thing, is democracy supposedly depends upon an informed electorate, right? We don't have an informed electorate. We have a disinformed electorate is what we've got. You look at Fox, I mean, and you know, that's the right wing, you know, and Mary will take me to task for this, but if you look at MSNBC, okay, you hear it from the left. I mean, there's some propaganda coming in from that side as well. You know, so my solution to that problem is you just read and think across the spectrum, you know, and then you decide what you're going to decide and hope you're right.
Do you think there's any, I understand that a lot of your remarks tonight have been more aimed at the federal government, right, and what goes on, because that's setting policy for how we deal with redistribution of wealth from a tax on revenue, or tax on income, or tax on capital.
It's not just the federal government. The Koch brothers are buying all sorts of elections at all sorts of lower levels. You know, and I think the attitude, I mean, on my more depressed days, I mean, the attitude, or my thoughts are, is that the people with the money and the power think that, well, I mean, there's no way we're going to allow these idiots to run the asylum. Lunatics are not going to be in charge. We know what's best, you know, and we will take charge and we will make sure that things go the way they ought to. And if it requires vote suppression, that's what we'll do. If it requires propagandizing and paying Rush Limbaugh $250 million a year, okay, to make sure that people are thinking the right thoughts, that's what we'll do. That's what they've done, and they've been very successful. To me, Piketty's main conclusion, showing this enormous growth, okay, in private capital, has been, to me, think long term. What has the right been busy doing since Roosevelt's time? Rolling back the New Deal. They've dismantled the entire New Deal. They don't like the high taxes and they don't like the regulation, and they've been successful. And to me, if you want to understand, this is how I understand it. I understand the incessant attacks on Obama, not because they disagree with his ideas. Some of the ideas that he's come up with were their ideas in the first place. The incessant attacks have to do with destroying his ability and effectiveness to get anything done whatsoever, because what they fear most, okay, is the revival of the New Deal. They don't want to pay high taxes again. They don't want people telling them how to run their business. And they've solved it. They've got propaganda networks which tell people what to think, and that's been successful. And they've bought Washington and every other government that they thought that was worth buying. And if you don't think so, take a look at the number of gerrymandered districts. Only 10% of the House seats are now competitive. And that is not an accident. They've had a plan, it's been long-term, and they've been successful. And the reason you see this terrific resistance, okay, to Obama trying to do anything that's progressive is because they fear that somehow or other, if he gains enough popular support, here comes the New Deal all over again, and they want no part of it. And that is, you know, and 50 cents might get you a cup of coffee, but that's my view of what's ultimately going on. It's a long war. And the reason I have bad days, is because I'm not so sure, okay, I'm not so sure that we haven't been defeated. But again, there's always hope. Yes, sir.
All right, this may be an unfair question to you because the law is now only 10 days old. But what about this new law against the stock market where it's supposed to take money out of the profits? It was supposed to crash the economy, crash the stock market and everything else, but so far everything seems to keep on running.
I've heard a little bit about it, but I mean, that's just the standard drama that is associated with, I mean, if you do this and it costs us money or it impairs what we want to do, I mean, the sky's going to fall. I mean, that's standard.
More questions?
All right. Thank you very much. I'll sit down and I'll listen to that.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, and thank you very much for asking some good questions. We could go on and on and on and on with questions, but it's time for comments. We've done good on our timing tonight, guys, so we have plenty of time left here in our program evening for you to get up and offer your comments, whether they be comments of agreement or comments of disagreement, or comments that might be supplemental to some things that Jim has said tonight. So try to take about 5 minutes to do that. Generally, we'll try to pay some attention to that. If you take everybody else's time up by preaching us a sermon for 42 minutes, that doesn't work, does it? And I think everybody understands that. So who would like to open up the comment section this evening? Give me a hand and come on up to the microphone. If we don't come up to the mic, then we won't get it on the video, so we want you to come up here and do that. We'd like to see your face and hear your voice. Mr. A comes up first. A on the alphabet, A on the speaker list. Come on up, Al.
Well, thank you for your perspectives on that presentation. I thought it was very interesting. One area that I completely disagree with, but not just directly on that, is this idea of paying your fair share of taxes. We should not have income taxes in this country at all. They are banned by the Constitution and they are still illegal today. That income tax law, the IRS and so forth, was passed with the Federal Reserve Act. And if you, I've mentioned this a dozen times, read The Creature from Jekyll Island, you will see that that is a criminal conspiracy of the greatest kind. All of the wars in the world are bankers' wars. They're going on all over the world still today, and they are bankers' wars. They destroyed Gaddafi and his government because he was using a gold-backed dinar, which would get rid of the international banking system. And now the BRIC nations are beginning to form an asset-backed currency to break away from the international banking system. This may lead to World War III. That's what's going on in Ukraine right now. Through the CIA, and we've got Blackwater over there, which is a very good term for that organization. We're fomenting all of that to try to keep that country from going back to Russia, and it's more related to Russia than any other. The international banking system is constantly destroying nations. It's like Thomas Jefferson said, and I've said this a dozen times, if we ever let a private bank get control of our money through inflation and deflation and the corporate structure that will grow up around it, because it can print all the money at once, give it to any corporation off the books at once that'll go and be totally dominant in an industry, that they will steal all of the property from our descendants and leave them homeless in the land that we founded. That man time traveled from today back to then to leave that message, in my opinion, frankly. That's what's happening. Take Ukraine years ago. There was an election. I watched a discussion by the lady who lost to the man who won it, and he became the president of Ukraine. And he allied with the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and set up the equivalent of a Federal Reserve and a Wall Street. And within a few years, all of those people became millionaires, basically. And the average wage in Ukraine went down 40% across the boards. This is what these bankers do everywhere they go. And it's sick what they're doing. And yes, capitalism, that is a term because it spells out greed and lust for power. That is a term I do not like. We need to go back to our constitutional free enterprise system with vigorous antitrust law enforcement. We need to get rid of NAFTA and GATT. We need to get rid of the UN, get out of it and get it out of the United States. That organization was set up by these world controllers who have done the European Union, they're trying to do the American Union, the African Union, and it will be a total dictatorship. You cannot trust people who want to go to the top in power, even in a church. You just can't trust any of them. The BRIC organization, and Joe, you pointed this out too today, they are forming an asset-backed currency, and I think Iceland gave the world a beautiful example when they had their financial collapse. Thousands of people took pots and pans and spoons and beat them loudly for hours and hours all around their congressional offices, and they ran the whole government out, held public elections, and elected a new government and started criminally prosecuting the bankers. That's what needs to happen all over this world as fast as possible. And people are waking up. Hungary kicked out the Rothschild banking system. We're dealing with phony money and phony value in paper, Wall Street. And that's where the ebb and flow of manipulated make money, lose money, they'll take it all away from us and win it when they know just when everything is going to change. I do not like the system we have going right now. Frankly, I never thought I would say something like this, but I see the purposes of Putin and Russia to be more like our founding fathers than anybody I know in Washington, D.C. today. And that makes me just furious. But we need to wake up to this. We need to get rid of this private banking system as fast as possible and put ourselves back on a government-controlled currency that does not benefit the bankers. Plus, the rich shouldn't be taxed. They just shouldn't be allowed to get these enormous amounts of the money that everybody working for them has earned. It should be more equally distributed down at the bottom rather than worrying about the tax system. The tax system does not put any money in the government. It feeds on the national debt that the bankers set up to earn. The government runs on constitutional taxes, always has. Import duties, impost, sales taxes, and so forth. We need to get back to the Constitution.
Well, thank you, Mr. Eddy. Who has some other comments to offer about our presentation tonight? Miss Susie? Bring it on up.
Okay, I'll time myself. I think it was an excellent talk. I really would like to hear more from you, Jim. One of the remarks that you made was that the corporations and the CEOs are beholden to the stockholders, right? In my management classes, when I was getting my degree in management, one thing that we learned was that there are many stakeholders that an organization must pay attention to. And the stakeholders may be at cross purposes. The stakeholders could include the employees, they could include the people in the areas where you own manufacturing facilities or where you distribute your goods or services. They could be the clients that you take on if you are not in any kind of goods, if you're into services. And one of the things that was hammered on so much was to be part of the community in such a way to further the corporation's brand, I guess. I'm sorry, I'm really hearing a lot of distraction out here. There we go. Okay, to improve the view of the corporation by all the stakeholders, to try to work together for everybody's good, and sometimes a compromise has to be made. One thing that I find very puzzling is, from learning that in school, seeing it in action. Now, I work with large companies, okay? I have to do that every day. And one thing that I will say is there are companies that are very, very top-notch good about how they treat their environmental issues, how they deal with their constituents, how they try to manage the cross purposes of all the different stakeholders. Those are the ones that seem to be a lot larger. And from this, they are paying their top level senior management, the CFO, the CEO, the higher level employees, they're paying them a lot more. But what I'm seeing erode, as Jim alluded to, is the fact that these enormous gains in profit and cash on the books are not being used to be fairly distributed to the employees who are helping gain that income for the company. As a matter of fact, I don't know how many of you are still working or in day to day. I think a lot of people here are retired. But what I will say is every time somebody retires at companies, it's almost more likely than not their work will be distributed among the people who remain. And so productivity, which has already increased, I think you said 80% over the time frame that you mentioned, the productivity is increasing, but so is the stress level, and the people who are left remaining to continue to work are just overwhelmed, overloaded, ready to blow. Okay? And I think that's one of the things that Jim is mentioning too, is that those who are still working and scrapping, we're also in the business of caring for elders, and in many cases still caring for children who have gotten through college who now don't have a job. And so the system needs to reward the people who are hardworking. And when I say hardworking, I don't necessarily just mean the service industry. I mean all hardworking people, and I consider the middle class to be hardworking, generally speaking. It's not like we're just sitting there anymore waiting for the phone to ring. You can come to work and there can be 24 emails that all require your attention that way, added on to the 36 emails that you didn't get to yesterday, okay, all requiring your attention and your time. I don't know what the answer is, but I do know one answer is for everyone to do as much as they can to inspire others to get more involved, be that in the community, voting. For those of you who are going to stand up after me and say your vote doesn't matter, I call bullshit. Your vote matters. If you need any evidence of how your vote matters, I dare you to take a look at the party platforms and contrast the Democratic Party platform versus the Republican Party platforms. Look at what they stand for on the environment, on education. If education is truly the way that we're going to crawl back out of this mucky pond that we're in, that's sucking everybody in except the people who can afford a helicopter to fly over it, or a Learjet or whatever, we've got to go back to making sure that people have that education and that opportunity to advance themselves through knowledge. And those of us who are retired in this room, in my estimation, your sense of noblesse oblige should be to mentor younger people, however you see fit. Thank you.
No, thank you, Susie. You always have some good perspective to add. And we have others in here who have viewpoints and ideas. Surely some more of you have some comments to make about our presentation tonight. Come on up. You'll do it. Come on.
I just want to seize upon the specific message that Jim gave about it matters what the revenue is used for. And that is absolutely key. I mean, when you have a terrible education system, you know, which we do, considering the wealth of this country, it's unexcusable that we have an education system which is as bad as it is. When you have infrastructure which is not getting better, it's not keeping pace with time. If you look at other countries, if you look at Japan, and if you look at China, and you look at some of the Scandinavian countries and even Europe, those people come here and they laugh. I mean, we don't have internet capability or broadband capabilities that they do. We don't have, you know, the highways that they do. We don't have the transportation systems that they do. We don't have the rail lines that they do. We don't have the airports that they do, on and on and on. So, but I think if people saw where their money was going, they wouldn't be so reluctant to pay taxes. But what you have is you've got, especially at the local level, you've got very conservative governments that slash things and refuse to spend money on these infrastructures. You look at these bridges, that are crumbling. You look at the roads here where they've said we're not even going to repave them. I mean, that's outrageous. I mean, because the fracking companies have to use them, they're just going to keep battering them up again. You know, I mean, but other people use them too. You know, but education too. Now, I'm not saying. Again, it matters where the revenue is used for. I'm not saying that we have to spend more and more money on education, because I think, frankly, we might be spending too much in a way. Because if you look per capita at what we spend per child as what maybe Sweden or Scandinavia, Finland does, or what South Korea does, we spend more, but we get less. So we got to rethink that. But if we saw the opportunities, if people that were out of work, for instance, people who've lost their job, were able to be retained, they wouldn't have a sense of hopelessness, which I think a lot of people categorize as laziness. You know, I think if you don't have a chance, if you don't have an opportunity to better yourself, what are you going to do? You're going to lay back and do nothing. However, if you see where your tax money is going, if you pay taxes and you see roads getting better, if you see the quality of the education getting better, and if you saw more participation in government and actually government working to solve problems, then I think there'd probably be a little bit more acceptance of what they're doing, as long as as long as we hold them to account. I think that the public does have an obligation, but there is such thing as public interest too.
Okay, there's a lot of stuff that has been talked about here. One of the delusions that I would like to see evaporate would be the idea of the economic pie. That out of this little pie, one person gets just a tiny little sliver and somebody else gets a huge big chunk of the pie. That is ridiculous, because our economy, and any country's economy, grows, it expands. And our economy has just boomed in the last, say, 100 years like that. And to compare it to a pie, that means it's fixed. And it doesn't get any larger. But the economy grows and expands. Please get rid of that silly idea of a pie. Some words that were used are very, very scary. Force. We're going to force people into something. We're going to knock heads. Now, I know that there are certain things like we're forced with a IRS to pay taxes. That is forcing. Yes, it is. But when we start using that word force in this American life and our freedom, those words are what are used in a totalitarian, authoritarian country. These are scary words. Do you understand that? Do you want your government to knock your heads together and force? And if you're not shaking over words like that, I'm sorry, but you should be. Fair share. That is the most elusive word, more expression. It is a figment of somebody's imagination. What is fair? Who is going to decide what is fair? Are we going to give that to the job of some bureaucrat, somebody in Washington? What one person says is fair, somebody says isn't fair. So what are we going to do? We're going to knock heads? We might. Our country grew strongly during the Industrial Revolution. He gave a very good definition. When did capitalism, free market, such like all really develop and grow and prosper? The Industrial Revolution, this is the late 1800s. And then we went for decades and upon decades with success, with growth, with expansion. That is when the United States of America became a strong powerhouse of an economy and a military power. That's when it all happened. And we went through wars, and you can be assured there were problems, there were abuses and hurdles and all of that. It wasn't perfect, but that's when the country became as strong as it did. The French Economist, he wants 80% taxes on the very wealthy. He said, Jim said a lot of things, you know, I'd like to see this, I'd like to see that, it never will happen. Well, I hope it never happens. 80%, that's in his book. He has given the political left the intellectual cover so they can punish the rich. He wants 60% taxes on people who make $200,000. If some of you make $200,000, he wants to tax you 60%. And he wants a global, do you know what global is? A global tax. That is the most bizarre idea I have heard from anybody, and it is getting credibility. That means every country of the world has got to get on board, and tax is going to be 2 to 5%, a global tax. That is just amazing. So will all the countries participate? Who's going to collect the money? Who's going to audit the collectors? Who's going to hold the tax collector accountable? Is this going to be another government bureaucracy that just wastes more money? Is it going to be another IRS that's supposed to collect taxes? How's the money going to be dispersed? Who's going to get it? Do you realize that when it comes to a whole lot of our American tax dollars, especially the welfare dollar, take $1 from us, when it goes through the inefficient, fouled up, corrupt system of government, the person who gets the money, they will get 25 cents out of the dollar. Will we have an IRS agents to enforce that sort of a global tax? Will some nations be taxed more than others? Will some get waivers, exemptions? We can have another corrupt bureaucracy that makes the organizers rich, the collectors. And when it's all said and done, we will still have economic inequality.
Okay, Let me pull this down a little. Hi everyone. One of the things that I thought was kind of interesting about this conversation was, it seems like that we live in as time has gone on, corporations have been less and less and less regulated. And so the motivation, there is no motivation to them other than corporate profits to increase their stocks and make their stockholders happy. There's no other motivation to do what's right other than the fact that they have employees that are an asset to their company. They've forgotten that. They've forgotten that their employees are assets. They're not, they're not just going to be, it's not like a piece of paper that they can just throw in the trash when they're done with it. Their employees are assets. One of the pluses about the industry that I work in is a service industry, and they really do value their employees because we provide a service to their clients. And what happens is that increases the value of the employee, which increases their wages over time. And then there's also, usually returns on that. So if the corporation does well, we get a certain bonus, at the end of the year. And what's happening is that the companies that value their employees in this way tend to have higher wages for their employees. It's the corporations that do not value their employees in this way are the ones that have the low wages. And so that's what we need to work on, is we need to remind these corporations that, stock market doesn't mean anything if they don't have employees doing their jobs, doing what they need to do. They can't make anything, they can't sell anything, they can't deliver any sort of service without their employees. They can pay their CEOs $2 million, but the CEOs are just managing people making the stuff they're selling. So that's what's important, and they've forgotten that. They've also forgotten that it's not okay to dump chemicals into our water, that it's not okay to do the things that they're doing that are not only hurting their employees, but also hurting the society as a whole. Then we have to turn around and give some of these companies tax subsidies and also we have to help pay these companies. We're help subsidize the companies to pay their employees less money. So Walmart can get away with paying substandard wages because we will provide the government subsidies to their employees. And we allow this to happen. And that's what's frustrating, and that's what's increasing the wage gap. Those kind of policies are what's increasing the wage gap. And until we as employees, until we as people of the country step back and say to people, look, you need to value your employees. They are worth more than the stuff you're selling because you wouldn't have anything to sell without them. And they don't look at it that way. And that's what's important. And that's what they're forgetting. And I've noticed that a lot of employees from other countries are better about that. So, I have a friend that works for a Swedish company. They tend to do better about valuing their employees, and they pay higher salaries as a reason. So that's what's going on, is that there's no motivation in the U.S. to value their employees and to treat them with the respect that they deserve for working an honorable living. And most people want to work an honorable living. Most people want to go to work and they want to provide for their families and they want to do and contribute to society. Most people do, but like what John was saying earlier, if you end up hopeless, you give up. You forget. And it's so hard because there's not enough people going into the educations where all the jobs are. There's not enough people getting technology degrees and science degrees. And that's where all the jobs are, and that's where the jobs are going to be in the future. And they may come back on life and sit back and go 10 minutes, oh my goodness, I'm 50 and I just got laid off and I need to be educated again, but I can't afford to go into 10, 20, 30, $40,000 debt to get another bachelor's degree. So we need to work on that, because we need to work on that. We need to train people in the right areas and train them ahead of time and make the training more affordable for everyone. Thanks.
Well, guys, we're doing real good on our timing, so we have plenty of time left for some additional comments to come up tonight. These are all subjects that everybody's looked at from some perspective, so I'm sure some of you will have a different view and some ideas that we haven't heard yet. So we have open ears tonight. Everyone expounded who intends to expound.
I'll make another comment.
You certainly may. Come right on in.
Well, we're probably chasing rabbits a little bit, but in regard to education, one of the best things I think we could do with our income tax and how much we have to pay would be for families that have kids that they are trying to educate, have an actual deduction for education where they can deduct college expenses. That would give them an incentive to send their kids to college. It would give them extra money. It's in the same category like home ownership. We can deduct the interest. There's a good reason to go ahead and buy a house. We want to keep that. It's a good idea, and we can have an interest deduction. Whatever you pay in interest, you can deduct it from your income tax. But have also an education deduction. And that would help every individual. It wouldn't help one politician, it wouldn't help a CEO, but it would help families, and it would help them to have more money to send their kids to college, because we want, like we've emphasized tonight, the kids to get a good education, and we want to remove any impediments.
Well, teach us what to do. Let's see, I think we have two more who will come up and give us a postscript. So we started with number A. Well, let's go with number A this round. Absolutely. Come on in.
I just remembered a type of corporation that I had read about years ago that is pretty much under the radar, but it is under United States law. And it is required that a certain amount of the income of that company be distributed to the stockholders. And typically people who, they had a whole list of them in this article I was reading, people who buy stocks in those companies are getting 25, 27, 30% return per annum regularly on all the companies in that flock of companies in that program. I think that would be a good program to put all corporations under. And cut out this thing of executives walking home with $30 million bonuses. Nobody's worth $30 million in an economy. Nobody is worth that. It's just not right, because there are thousands of people under them that got them there by doing their jobs. Again, back on the tax thing, having a tax deduction for education, just get rid of the entire income tax system, then everybody's got a lot more money, because all of that income tax again goes to one purpose: to pay interest on the national debt. Your checks are not made out to the Treasury, they're made out to the Federal Reserve, and that national debt is a fraudulent debt against the people, and it needs to be eliminated, because our government can print its own money with no interest. And this borrowing money from the Fed that didn't have money anyway, all they do is just enter a computer entry for the money, and suddenly we're paying taxes on it. That's what it amounts to. We need to get rid of the IRS, get rid of the Federal Reserve, go back to the Constitution, and somebody in here needs to help me find out what is the program under which that corporate structure I mentioned is. I remember it from years ago, and I'd like to know. I think it's a great one.
As a postscript to what I said earlier, I think the primary problem with the CEO or the corporate profits and anything attached to that, namely CEO salary, is in no small part related to our retirement system, which is money given to a 401k managed by banks, and that's where the stocks are sold and bought in seconds. You know, if unless the value of a company in the short term rises significantly, that CEO is out on his butt, pretty much. So he's forced to do things that make Wall Street happy. He's forced to cut jobs. That's always what they do. That's the first thing. As soon as they do it, watch, stocks go up. You know, they're forced to streamline. Stocks go up even more, you know. That's the problem. I mean, so if you had people that were more invested in the company and actually attended the annual shareholder meetings and had a stake in the company rather than just a few dollars, I mean, rather than a part of a corporation for a few seconds, you know, I don't know where I'm invested, you know, I mean, but if you really want to have a stake in it, then you can do something about it. That used to happen. That doesn't happen anymore.
Okay, guys. Repeated calls. Going once, going twice, going 3 times. Okay. Well, I could rattle and ramble. I will say a couple of things. On the subject of income inequality, which is a term that's gotten to be very heavily used in our society. It's used by our, verbal commentators and newscasters, and it's used in writing. The way it's been used has become a somewhat evil word. Unequal just means this is higher than that. And I think by inference, when someone uses it in that context, they're referring to things that they personally feel are too inequitable to be fair or right by their definition. Now, what is their definition? Well, 310 million of us, there are probably definitions all over the map, so we don't all think exactly alike. But we do find ourselves using terms and listening to terms that are not very specific. I have never heard a person in the political world stand in front of a microphone like we're doing here tonight and say, I think it is fair and equitable for the lowest paid hourly worker in a business to make this percentage of what the salary of their boss is, or their boss's boss, or the person who owns or leads the company at the top. Have you ever heard anybody say what they think the magic formula for fair is?
Those first 2 words were a lie.
What 2 words?
I think.
I don't know what is going on inside that brain. I guess it's something else. But that is a hard to grasp term. We always use the example, for instance, of the person who's starting out on minimum wage. And the last statistics that I read as an accountant, I think about 43% of the people who start off making minimum wage, and that may not be that high today, but several years ago, were people who started in full-time jobs at the bottom of the ladder, a beginning level job. The rest were part-time jobs. high school students, college students, parents not working full-time, staying home, caring for children and working part-time, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. The list goes on and on. So yes, people do start off at the bottom. You don't hear people getting up at the podium and saying how long people stay at the bottom. People do move between the compartments of earned income. People don't commonly start off in the bottom quintile. If you break income, earned income down into 5 brackets, people don't start off at the bottom and jump to the top in one step, unless they do something really magic, like a young person out in the Bay creates a software package in their garage, and they're making nothing. They're spending all the family's income and savings that they've borrowed, and they're creating something all of a sudden. The next year they make $7 million, and they take the company public, and they're worth $28 million. So those things happen, but they're not common. Well, what's also not common is you look at the bottom and you look at the top. What's at the top is a handful of people. The numbers which are published for us to read in the press don't represent those people's salaries. You almost never see their salary disclosed in public. They may have made $20 million last year in reportable income. Their salary may be $2 million. Not cheap, that's not a zero salary by any means. And they may have earned another $2 million in bonus, cash bonus, for meeting the goals and objectives that the board set up for them that year, or sort of the vice president level goals the president set for them. So they made $4 million, $20 million in total. Where does that come from? Well, basically it's not money. It's stock option values that are now required by the federal government to be reported. They used to not be reported. So when you take our noble Paris economists' numbers and you spread them back in time and you see how much the numbers have gone up, some of that is very real. Some of it to me is totally unfair. When these board members all get together and vote each other humongous stock options and bonuses, it doesn't seem to have any relevance to the contribution they made to the company and its profits. I agree, that is unfair. But when you look at the 300 million people who live here in the country, there are a lot of people in the middle. That's the biggest group of all. There are a handful up at the top, and there are a handful that start at the bottom and they stay there for some time. Most people climb up out of the bottom. The middle class is the biggest by far in number and in income. You talk about taxing the rich. If you take the taxes the top 5% in the United States pay, that equals the tax that the other 95% pay. Is that fair? Is it too much? Is it not enough? Probably depends on which kind of family you're in. If you see your tax bill, you probably think it's unfair if you're at the top. If you're lower, you'd like for your tax bill to be less and them to pay more. Human nature. Will that make the economy better? If you take what we would call excessive income, like we've discussed, several of us here have discussed tonight, the big fat stock option plans and high bonuses, some people and some companies at the very top. I've never really enumerated them, but out of 300 million people, it seemed like a tiny number. If you take all that, I've read articles that show what the numbers are. If you take all that money away from them and you redistribute it, another word that we use a lot, to everybody else in the country, we don't get very much out of it. Because there's a lot of us and there are a handful of them. So we do have things that are not quite nice, but when we read about them in the press, a lot of times they're making their point. And they're not really telling you some of the detail that you would probably like to see and know and come to your own conclusion. And one of the nice things about our group here tonight is that we have people who come from different perspectives and different viewpoints, and we can all say things that we've seen, hopefully learn something. We probably are not going to change our minds. We had a speaker come some time ago, and they stood up at the beginning of their presentation and they said something like this: if I could show you that your viewpoint about whatever his subject was that night is totally unsupported and mine is correct, will you change your mind? And nobody said they would change their mind. That's our privilege, isn't it? I mean, we can lock into our viewpoint and we can go to the grave with it. And we can be right and we can be wrong, but it's ours. So that's one of our privileges. And, you know, here in this group, in this dining room, you know, we're able to talk about almost anything and nobody gets up and throws food at us. I think in the now, what is it, 5.5 years since Tom and I got this cranked up and started down at the Circle Grill the first night with a speaker who's going to be here in 2 weeks again from SMU. We just never imagined all the things that we would see and hear, but wow, has it been fun. We've met some wonderful people. We're so glad you guys all come. Thanks so much. We really are glad you're here, and always feels free to stand up and say what you say. A lot of times I choose to say nothing just because you guys all say so much. And tonight I let a little bit out of the bag. But I don't want anybody to throw their food at me, and I don't expect anybody to, change their political party affiliation on the basis of anything I've said, or become a supply side economist versus a demand side economist, right? We've done good on timing. What time is it gotten to be now? Man, we are walking on the water tonight. Yeah, we're down to everything except Jim gets to get up and put the frosting on the cake. Come on up, Jim, let's do it. I motor mouthed for 10 minutes, so I use my Tom Berry privilege to spin over the alarm tonight, so forgive me.
Well, I'll make this as quick and as painless as possible. Let's start with Albert. I agree. I'm not in love with the banks. I'm well aware of the fact that the banks have had 3 taxpayer-financed bailouts in my adult lifetime. It's capitalism on the way up, socialism on the way down. There's no doubt about that. And I like the idea of vigorous antitrust. But getting back to the Constitution, I mean, to me, and you, I don't want to get back to an originalist interpretation because it doesn't work. I mean, the Constitution means what we need it to mean. And we live in this democracy, and these gentlemen back in 1776 did the best they could and wrote something they thought would endure. And as far as human rights are concerned, God-given, inalienable, I'm with you. But as far as the rest of it is concerned, it's a living document and it needs to be interpreted. It's a lot like the Bible in that respect. There's how many Christian denominations? And why? They can't agree on what the Bible means, right? Same deal with the Constitution. I mean, what I've settled on, it means what we need it to mean, and we the people who are properly informed, who've got their heads on straight. And we're a long ways from that, but that's my dream. All right. Now, the other thing you mentioned about Putin, it's very eerie because I gave a talk a while back. And remember I mentioned that Putin had told after the reign of the oligarchs, they completely screwed everything up because, it was crony capitalism on steroids. Remember that? Well, he threw a lot of people in jail, leaned on a lot of people, and he brought all these company heads in and said, you know what, we will compete globally selling oil and gas worldwide. That's Gazprom. But you will be a national champion. You being the corporation, right? And I like that. And do you know where he got the idea from? He got the idea from a 1976 PhD thesis that was written by 2 graduate students in economics at the University of Pittsburgh. National champions, right? What a concept. They have to think about something other than, somebody else mentioned the stakeholder. You mentioned the stakeholder, Susie. There are stakeholders. Yeah, it's everybody in the society. You're going to be now, if they go too far, the state owns 51%. Okay, and I don't think that I would agree with that. But yeah, you and I can agree on the national champion bank. I would like corporations to think of themselves as national champions who have a vested interest in the health and well-being of American society and the middle class. Okay. And then, let's see, Susie. I didn't disagree with yeah, the argument is that, and it's correct, a number of people said this, not just Susie, but I mean, these companies are beholden to stockholders and say, well, that's it, we don't have to worry about anything else. But one of the reasons that, I think it was, who was it? Oh, Shelley was mentioning about not valuing employees and not paying them enough. There's 3 things that are going on. One, of course, is static wages. They can get rid of it. They can get away with it because where's the power to force, I use the word again, force fairness. What do you need to force things? You need power. Unions have been destroyed. Now, you may say good riddance. I don't. You need force. Okay, now, when I used force in connection with the government, I want to qualify that. I don't mean that they kick people around and intimidate them, although some of us are old enough to remember what Kennedy did when United States Steel raised prices and he didn't like it, and it was an inflationary environment. That was an abuse of power that you and I both recall, and I think you and I could agree on that. But here's what I want. What I want is for government to regain, its independence. I want it to be a referee with a whistle in its mouth, and I want him to enforce a set of rules that we've all agreed upon, rather than being the puppet and the tool of people who have bought them. That's what I want. And in that respect, I have no problem with them, using the whistle, throwing the flag, and penalizing them and using force. Go ahead. And if they violate the law, put some people in jail. Yeah, so, I want the government to be able to do that rather than being a lapdog from some lobbyist that's bought them. Okay, and let's see. Now, the issue of fairness and the pie. Well, one thing we can all agree on, there's never going to be an agreement between competing interests on what's fair. I fully agree with that. You cannot, what I think is fair, you won't, because we have a conflict of interest. That's built into the situation. There's nothing you can do about it, And how do you resolve that? The way you resolve that is by balancing power. Because human nature is human nature, right? You got to balance power somehow. Now, if the government can't do it for you, a government that is not bought and paid for by the lobbyists, but is subject to the will of the people, with the way it's supposed to be, we shouldn't have any problem. Or, if you want other agencies to do it for you, there's nothing wrong with union representation. Because there's nothing wrong with compensation committees taking care of their own. Why can't unions take care of their own? It seems utterly fair to me. Now, the bottom line in all of this is everything we've talked about thus far is detail. I mean, it's important, but it's detail. Now, I'm going to give you what I think is the main overarching problem that absolutely needs to be addressed. People don't believe in the system. That's the problem. And you talk to people and you say, well, I mean, how much confidence do you have in, the United States Congress? 11%. It's pitiful. 40% for Obama sounds dazzling in comparison. But I mean, even that's not very good. Now, in the so-called authoritarian states with managed economies, they believe in their system. True, but they are willing to trade off freedom for economic security, and that definitely is the case, in China. And I do not deny that, and I think that we need to preserve our democracy because so much is at stake when it comes to human rights, and we will both agree on that. But what I think we need to recognize is that human nature being what it is, fairness as far as economic matters is a perpetual problem. Class struggle is built into the system because you got wage earners and investors. Whether we like it or not, it's here. And how do you fix that? Well, you don't. You just balance power and you hope for the best. And from my perspective, the government, with all of its bureaucratic shortcomings, which I would freely admit, I hate red tape. I've dealt with the government. I've been frustrated, this, that, and the other. I mean, I sure as hell am going to trust a government bureaucracy, to do a better job of regulating the banks than the banks did regulating themselves. I mean, the banks failed miserably. And the reason they failed miserably because they knew they could get away with it because they knew they could count on a government-financed bailout, which is you and me. Well, yeah, somebody needed to go to jail. Somebody definitely needed to go to jail to put the fear of God into them, or whatever powers there be. But I will shut up, and I will remind you one more time that everything we've discussed tonight is detail, except one thing. People don't believe in the system, and it's getting worse, and until we fix that, we're nowhere. I'm done.
Build our confidence. All right. Is there anybody here tonight who has not put their $3 contribution in the bucket? Where's the bucket? Right here. It has 5 fingers on it, and it redistributes your contribution to buying the speaker's dinner and paying for the ads in the paper. And Tom gave me a financial statement this week just before he went out of town, and our net for the month of this year so far is a big fat zero, plus or minus $10. So it's running exactly even, which is good. Not a profit-making entity, but we do pay our basic expenses. All right, is that it? Yeah, one more. Okay. Thanks again. We have time to get out tonight. We'll retire, and some of us will retire to Starbucks in Casa Linda, so come down if you'd like. We'd enjoy your company, and we can talk in a little different setting.
This is William, your videographer from Two I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please leave comments below, or like us or follow us and get notices of all our videos. We love it even when you call. So when visiting the Barbeck's restaurant, tell them you want your reservation to the next College of Complex class.